Hi, my name is David Reske, CEO of Now Speed Marketing, and welcome to this edition of Marketing in the Now, where we talk about the best ideas in digital marketing. My guest today is Abby Borden, founder and CEO of Inkwell GTM, a go-to-market consultancy. She's also been a fractional CMO and a VP of marketing. Abby, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Abby, we've been talking about the marketing challenges for early stage startups, including, balancing the needs between strategy and execution. These are companies that are just getting off the ground. They don't have a lot of money, and you've done a lot of work in this area. Um, what do startups really need when it comes to marketing?
Yeah, I think, so much of it to me comes down to articulating the story incredibly well. And that's where you need to start. And so I think from my experience, oftentimes we get distracted by the allure of events and digital marketing campaigns and other ways that we can spend from that perspective. But if we haven't nailed that story, um, our execution just becomes wasted dollars, which is super dangerous for an early stage company. And so I think the biggest thing to focus on early on is really like the positioning and messaging that goes into crafting the story and doing so consistently in a compelling way. And that I would think is like the biggest trap that I've seen pretty much every single time I've engaged with an early stage startup.
So, getting the story right, you're saying is really important. But if they don't get any traffic to it, how does that really help the company, right? So they've got to, you get the story right, and actually talk to me about the difference between the story and
Yeah.
the concept of the product or the vision of the company, because I think often people get confused between those different things.
Yeah, I think for me, the story actually really comes down to who are you for and why are you going to make their lives so incredibly different? And what is the compelling truth that you need everybody to know immediately? And why do you exist, right, as a company? And so it's not just about the vision of where you're headed, but the problems that you're solving and for whom. And so being able to articulate from a positioning perspective what makes you incredibly unique, what are the alternatives and how are you different, right? Who are you for? Who are you in service to? And being focused on that early on then allows you and enables you to have those super targeted campaigns that you then can use to drive traffic and engage with the right audience, right? We talk about ICP so much, or your ideal customer profile. Being able to nail that early on and having that focus just ensures that you don't fall into the trap of wasted time, wasted resources, wasted money, which can absolutely be a momentum killer for that early stage.
So why is it so hard for founders to get that right? Because you'd think that if you spend all this time, and by the
Yeah.
way, on the side, I teach a course at Boston College on business planning. So I'm teaching
Okay.
undergraduates who are thinking about a business idea and coming up with
Yeah.
part of what they have to do is they have to be able to articulate the mission, vision, and really create that story for the business. And I see them struggle with the same thing. So, but you're talking about people who've put in real dollars, maybe quit their job, they've raised money,
Yep.
friends and family or investors, and they're out building the business maybe when you get involved with them. Why is it hard for them to get that story right,
Yes.
and strong when that's the probably the first thing they should have done maybe before they launched, right? So
Yeah.
why is it difficult?
Well, and I think, so often founders are used to selling the story to investors, and investors are going to buy into and want to buy into the long-term vision of the company, right? And so, where do you see yourself in 5 or 10 years, and how are you going to change the market, and what type of disruption are you bringing? Whereas your buyer, depending on where they are in their life cycle and the level of knowledge they have about like the product or the problem that they're solving, they might be, if investors are up here, a buyer might be all the way down at the bottom and needs really practical application of how you're going to solve their problem today. And so, usually, a lot of my conversation with early stage founders is not a matter of if, but when, and how do we prioritize, right? Getting to the end vision, and what does that look like? What are the different positions we can take? One of my absolute favorite books and resources on this topic is April Dunford's Obviously Awesome book on like market positioning. And so she just provides great context and tools in terms of how founders should be thinking about, how you sell your vision, what your investor deck looks like, and how your kind of early stage pitch deck to your buyers should look very different. If you are copy and pasting your investor deck to your market, it's probably going to miss a little bit, right? In terms of where they are and their understanding of the problem and the landscape, just a totally different audience. And so I think that's where, you know, I get a lot of founders who come fresh off of a round of funding and have just sold that investor story time and time again. They've done it dozens, maybe even hundreds of times that they've made that pitch. And to switch your brain into, okay, yep, that's the art of what's possible. I need something super practical, tactical that I can like sink my teeth into as potentially a super nascent buyer that has no experience in the space that you're talking about, right? And so I think that's where there's a big trap.
Yeah, I love it. So they've got to really shift from the story for investors to the story for buyers, and that's a tough transition. And it's so funny as a website development and digital marketing agency, we see that all the time. We'll go to look at a company's first website, the first pages that the founders put up themselves, and sometimes it reads like the pitch deck. It doesn't talk about
Yep.
who the product is for, what the features and benefits are, right? All that other stuff. And you're talking about something even more powerful than that. So they've got to come up with a story for the buyers. Now, let me ask you, do they need multiple stories for the buyers? Do they need to think about, the economic buyer and the user buyer and maybe the technical buyer if it's a tech product? Do they need to think deeper about the story, or is it like they just need to come up with one story for what the product is really all about? How deep do they need to go?
Yeah, I mean, I always like to think about it as like high level, you position the company and the product that exists today. You can create a messaging framework off of that, which again is just some of your key story components, the words you really want to use consistently, right, to make noise in market, and how are you telling your story around your like what is unique to the company. But then that all translates into copy, and copy really should be tailored to the audience. So who are you trying to talk to? What are they trying to get out of? What do they want to hear? What are you trying to tell them? How are you trying to be helpful to them? What is the medium, right? All of that should inform the copy that you're pulling together. And so oftentimes we'll see, a translation of the core messaging to speak to that specific buyer. From an early stage perspective, I am always about less is more. Pick one and focus. Do right. It's everything we've always heard about, like do one thing incredibly well. If you try to be everything for everyone, you'll be nothing, right? And so I think just leaning into that focus is super helpful, but knowing that, from messaging comes copy and that it's going to depend on the audience is still really helpful.
Yep. So definitely. So focus, get the message right, make sure it's for the buyer, focus on one target market or ideal customer profile, get that story strong. So talk to me about the impact that that can have. So if you assuming, let's talk about the tale of
Yeah.
two entrepreneurs. One
Yep.
that it doesn't have the strong story that is confusing the investor message with the buyer message and kind of goes to market. And someone else who does that really well with an emotionally connected, strong story that really hits the buyer right where they need to be hit. So, what's the impact difference that those two scenarios can have on a fledgling company?
Yeah, I mean, I think from my experience, it really leans into traction and how quickly they're able to build traction from truly what at the end of the day matters most, which is, signed deals and contracts, and, revenue at the tail end of all of that. And so, what I've seen for folks who maybe don't prioritize that or are pitching the investor deck is they get a ton of feedback from the market that folks are bought into their vision, that they are, excited about what the company is building. And yet none of those conversations are translating into deals. And I think that that's really important to understand and still continue to prioritize, right? As an early stage, your first goal, depending, if you're going mid-market or enterprise or product-led growth, but your first goal could be 10 or 100 contracts, right? Like just focus on what is that first milestone and get to that point and then continue to expand. I think when we think about the long tail of it, again, kind of balancing this vision and where we think we can go and how big the company can be to where you are today and starting at zero, or really close to it, right? It's just like, what is the next win that you need, and how can you be as focused on that as possible? Without the focus or just kind of that tailoring of story and really, frankly, compelling messaging that is going to help convert deals, you just see a lot of like bloated pipeline and folks that aren't moving forward, and deals that feel stuck, because they don't understand how the company and the product is going to impact their business today. They are bought in and excited for you, from that perspective, but not necessarily bought in and ready to sign a check.
I love it. Don't confuse excitement with deals, right?
Yes.
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 I'm reminded of one of my favorite quotes from Bugs Bunny. It's actually from Daffy Duck, who's often the villain in those stories. It's not the principle of the thing, it's the money. Sometimes it just comes down to, are buyers willing to pay for what you have? And if you get the story right, you're saying that you get past the excitement and onto buyers who are really willing to pay for you to solve their problems in a product or a solution or a service, and you hit that nail on the head. And
100%.
and that's what the story is doing for you. Talk to me about the role of testing in that messaging process. Are you, through your strategic work with clients or, other ways of getting there, are you looking for the big idea, the lightning bolt, the story that's just right through, and I presume you're doing things like customer interviews or talking to, competitors or research. You're trying to come up with a story with alignment with the team. Um, but do you come up with multiple stories and then let's say, hey, let's try this, let's try that, let's try the other thing,
Yeah.
let's see what sticks, and then go with something you get some feedback on? Or is it in a more strategic market research process where we come up with four stories, we do surveys and interviews? Talk to me about that. How deep is the testing and the methodology in getting to that story?
Yep. I think, from my perspective, early stage could go the route of really methodical, really well defined, and maybe even long, like a long timetable for some testing and research. I prefer a little bit of a more resourceful approach. There's feedback loops every single day that companies are getting in terms of what's working and what's not, right? And so typically what I like to do, and it depends on the company, but one of my clients recently just went through a entire positioning and messaging exercise in 2 weeks. So we went incredibly fast based on, what was unique in the company and where did we differentiate, knowing the market, right? What are those key pieces we wanted to put together? We immediately had the team at a conference where they were testing messaging and kind of articulating the core story and saying, okay, this is what really resonated. This is what we got a lot of like yeses and next steps, right? If we're getting people to book the next meeting and to have the next conversation, it's an early indicator that our story is working and it's compelling from that perspective. You can also use so many organic channels to test, from that perspective. Big fan of doing kind of quick iterations on the website to see if things are working from that perspective, but you're likely not going to have enough traffic to do truly statistical significant testing, at that point, depending on your business. If you do have enough traffic, amazing. Most of the early stage do not, right? And so it's just about how do we get as much feedback as possible and get in market. I think, time is of the essence for these early stage folks. It can be a momentum killer if you're kind of stalling or waiting to get it perfect. There is no notion of perfect. Messaging is frankly something that should be redone on a regular basis to make sure that as your product evolves and as your customer evolves and the use cases do, you're evolving your messaging as well. And so I love to kind of build the framework, make sure that teams are enabled on how to tell that story, and then really focus on getting as many kind of artifacts out in the wild to see what's working, what's not, and how do we continue to iterate and grow from there.
Yeah, very, very powerful. So err on the side of getting in market and getting feedback from all of those channels, whether it's customers or your website or wherever you can.
Absolutely.
learning from that and then evolving that to get the messaging right. So let's shift a little bit from, that early stage company that needs the messaging and, the storytelling to now let's say you've helped them get the message positioning right as far as they know early on. Now you need to help them get customers and they're going to want, is it lead gen or the brand awareness or whatever. What are the first tactics you usually see early stage companies executing or needing to execute in order to get off the ground?
Yeah, I think so much of it does, and this is going to be a broken record for me. It depends on who their audience is, right? And how they're buying and what the buying cycle looks like. And that is so incredibly important for founders and early teams to remember is that if you're dealing with an enterprise sales cycle where it's a 6 to 7 figure contract, you're talking about digital transformation and long implementation, right? That whole process is going to look very different than a product-led growth company that is looking for quick signups and free weekly trials and all of those components. And so it's great to kind of make sure you're clear on what that looks like and then how can you meet that audience where they are to get them engaged and convert from that perspective. I think typically, once we're done from a positioning perspective and we've done some messaging work on the go-to-market side, we really start to talk about channel strategy. And so, what does the role that your sales team plays? Is outbound going to be an effective channel for you? What do we think we're doing from an inbound perspective? Again, like, is this something where people are actively searching for solutions and they're problem aware? Or is it something you're completely needing to educate the market on? If so, I probably wouldn't invest a ton of money very early on organic search or something like that just because folks don't even know that it's a problem, right? And so they're not searching for it. You have to provide a lot of thought leadership and education up front. And that, if in that instance, that would look like, what are we doing to get potentially the founder out at events? How are we providing that thought leadership content? Where are we kind of providing some maybe provocative insights or just messages around things that they're doing today are broken, and how they can do it differently, right? And how do we create that problem awareness? And so I think that is certainly like one channel approach. You have events from that perspective that can be really important too. Again, it's going to depend on where your audience is and how they're making their buying decisions and what can be important and impactful from that side as well. I do think that it's really helpful and even to think about a campaign-based strategy. So, you pick your ideal customer profile, you've really well defined it. Maybe there's a couple of different facets. A great example of this is I work with a lot of e-commerce SaaS applications. And within e-commerce, you certainly still have, you know, health and wellness, beauty products, furniture and home goods, apparel and accessories, right? That still operate differently. And so maybe your early customers or where your strongest use cases are is in the beauty market, right? And so there's an opportunity to build a really strong integrated campaign across, beauty, focused on the beauty audience to try and convert and win as many of those deals as quickly as possible. And that can be multifaceted to include events, a social strategy, paid strategy, really targeting those lists, right? And it all stems from truly understanding like who best benefits from the product that you've built and the outcomes that you deliver. And then how do you provide proof of that super early on and make that message resonate?
Yeah, those are all amazing tactics and things you could do. I'm wondering if, you're that early stage startup really trying to get off the ground. If in today's world you can afford to do more than you could in the past, it strikes me that back in the day, everything you talked about was very expensive. You're going to do, trade show booths or launch an ad campaign or buy pages in a trade publication, do direct mail. All those things were very expensive. Are we moving to a world where, companies can do a little bit of everything, and should they be doing a little bit of everything? You mentioned, paid, digital, you got social, Maybe there's speaking at events, maybe there's a website, maybe there's some SEO, the building content. There's a lot of stuff to do. Do you encourage, the startups to say, let's just do one thing. Let's have a website with some good blog articles, or maybe we just do events. Or do you try to, because things are so much less expensive and easier to do today, do you encourage them to do everything, but maybe have a particular focus? And again, of course, we're
Yep.
generalizing on companies,
Yeah.
but how do you kind of think about the options that companies have today to get in market?
Yep. I would say I absolutely lean towards getting as much breadth across channel as possible because everything we know about how buyers buy from any industry perspective, right, is that it doesn't take one impression to get somebody to engage, right? So you need to be able to be in front of them dozens of times. I think I've seen upwards of 100 touch points for a B2B buyer to convert, right? And so, and to engage and to create that awareness. And so, how can you do that if all you're focused on is building blog content? Because you're going to have a whole world where that audience is missing you. And so, my recommendation is to be really narrowly focused on the audience. Things start to get really expensive when you lose that focus. So you can run paid digital campaigns for a couple grand across, LinkedIn or some of the other ones, right? But you're just really narrowly focused on what that starts to look like. You can do an incredibly thoughtful direct mail outbound campaign to 100 accounts for, $1,000. And so that just becomes something that when you have that focus allows you to put whatever money you have available as narrowly defined as possible. Even trade shows is a great example. We were just at Shop Talk, which is a huge e-commerce trade show that happens. It's called the Super Bowl of e-commerce brands and retail from that perspective in a trade show, and it can absolutely cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to pull a team together and have a presence there. But there are so many great grassroots and creative ways to make your presence known. We've seen teams do matching outfits. I'm a big believer in show shoes, where folks just have really bright, obvious shoes. You can do events with other partners. Partnering earlier on is a great way to make your dollars stretch as well. So pulling together with really great complementary products that are also speaking to the same ICP is just a great way to say, you take your couple of grand and their couple of grand, and all of a sudden you have a really big event and you can benefit from that. And the teams can pull together too, which can be really effective if you don't have, which most early stage companies do not have, an expert in every area of marketing. As you mentioned, there's a lot of them. So,
So you can be really creative when it comes to thinking about how to spend dollars. That's one of the benefits of working with somebody like you is you have all this deep experience. You can find they can help you can help them figure out which ways to go, which things are most cost effective, where they can economize, where they can't, where they have to really build
yep,
their brand and really do a great job. Talk to me about measurement, how and systems. So
yep,
yeah, one of the things I've seen a lot of early stage companies do is invest very quickly in CRM systems or marketing automation platforms, even before they have a website, And so are those things, and there's, I forget how many marketing tools are out there. Like there's like 10,000 different
yep.
marketing tools out there today. And so how much should early stage companies be thinking about the marketing stack, the tech stack, investing in the infrastructure so that they've got the measurement and the systems in place to grow versus getting the story right, doing a few things well, testing, or do they have to do both and do it all well? So how do you think about that side of it, the other
Um,
side?
Yeah, no, David, it's what probably my favorite question so far because I agree. I absolutely see a lot of wasted dollars, frankly, that go into some of these big systems and tools. My favorite platform and system for early stage is your good old trusty Excel or Google Sheets. There is so much that you can do in free or next to free software to prove, right? Prove it first, scale it second. You have not proven that you have a go-to-market motion that works. And so if it's setting up, a system of events that happens through Notion, which is a very inexpensive tool for people to use, right? And track a whole company profile and how you're prospecting and everything from that side. Um, or it's just tracking your pipeline in Excel and contacts and everything that you have on that side. I think we absolutely start to see some bloat. I have come in more than once and had to redo implementation of these CRMs because how it was initially implemented, the company has either pivoted or we didn't know enough about what was necessary to build that automation in terms of what attributes we wanted and cared about and what things we wanted to be able to trigger off of and what the right stages were and everything on that side. And so systems are phenomenal and have a point in time where they come into play. If you have not proven like how you're going to win those first 10 deals even, right? That is going to be super hard for any type of what are you automating? Right? Like that's the big question is what are you doing? What are you automating? Who's even using that tool? Oftentimes you have one seller maybe on top of the founder, or it's just the founder. So it's like what's the need to do that then? There absolutely is a time and place. It's just a little later.
Yeah. I love it. So you're really focusing on what's really necessary at the time. And when you're in that startup mode, you may not need all the fancy systems. You may be able to track it and do it very inexpensively with some of these free or very, very cheap tools. But there does come a time when you go beyond, getting 10 deals, when you start to get several employees and you want to track it with the
Yep.
CRM system, and then you have to evolve it, past then. So I don't think you're saying that to ignore all of that. You're just saying do it at the right time and in stages as you grow into market, right?
Yep, 100%. And what so many people I think often forget about too is that all of these marketing automation systems need content to deliver value to your audience. And so oftentimes we'll see things like hiring of sales, sales team members and implementation of really expensive CRMs far before there's any investment in marketing. And I always ask the question of, great, what are we telling them? What are we delivering? What value are we delivering? How have you been engaging? What's been working? And oftentimes the answer is, well, it's not really working, and that's why we found you. And this is why we want to get in a little bit deeper, right? And so it's like, man, if we just went in a different order, a little bit and just focused on like who are we trying to win? Why did they care about us? What problems are we solving? How can we build compelling content? And do so manually. And then as soon as you start to feel a little bit of tension that like we could go faster if we had some tools, that's exactly your right signal to start implementing something more.
Yeah, that's perfect. And it's going to work much better. What you really talked about is a system where you're building the traction first before you're maybe even hiring the sales team to execute against that. So you're figuring out where the market traction is with the messaging, with the early, organic tools or the inexpensive marketing tools. But once you get that traction, then companies can invest in tools or systems or salespeople or other things to scale it up. But until you have that, and I guess that's the nature of the startup, right? If they
Yep.
had all that, they wouldn't be a startup. They'd be like a big company.
Exactly.
They're really trying to prove that early demand. So, in your experience, what are the best metrics they should be looking at in terms of marketing? What are the measurement milestones they should be thinking about to see are we getting traction? Is it working? How do they know?
I think frankly, early stage, it's really, really rarely about, how is marketing performing versus sales or, how does each individual function? And you're looking at, again, the traction as the company as a whole. And so how are you like what's the progress towards those first 10 customers? And is our approach, our collective approach, and oftentimes you're talking about 10, maybe 20 employees, right, who are working together to solve this. So it's not the business just isn't complex and big enough to say, oh, this is Abby's metric and this is David's metric and this is what we're doing, right? We are in it together and we are getting creative and figuring out what we can solve to move deals through and get them closed. And so ultimately, we see so much of this continue even as companies grow is that marketing's contribution is revenue. And that is kind of the number one thing that you need to be thinking about, as a marketing leader or as somebody who's kind of plugging in is what are we doing? And then what are all the leading indicators that revenue is coming? Maybe it's not coming yet, but are we seeing, as I mentioned, like those deals moving through stages, or are we just having great conversations? So getting doors open, having those initial conversations, incredible. Are you booking the next meeting? If no, right, something's not hitting right in that first meeting, how can you tackle that first meeting as a team? And then, moving through and continuing to look at that. I think as companies grow, you can start to ask the question of, do we have a churn and retention issue? We just put all of this money and effort into acquiring these customers and they're not using the product, or we're finding that they're churning, 6 months later. Like what's happening, right? And so I think understanding across the board the customer life cycle and what are the key metrics to move somebody through. I always love to say from unaware all the way to advocate. That is your customer life cycle. And so it doesn't stop when deal is done or anything from that perspective, but how are we moving folks through? And that's really the traction is we're starting to see momentum and conversions happening at every stage and every step for that life cycle.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, you talked about like getting the team all aligned, focused on revenue, and a lot of different things they need to do to execute to make that all happen. We just have a few minutes left, and I just want to come back to one other subject. And maybe this is
Yeah.
advice that I'd ask you to give to that CEO, the startup CEO. What kind of a team do they need, a marketing team to execute? Because you've talked about so many things from positioning to strategy to understanding how to do organic to be able to send email to setting up a CRM to maybe helping them with PowerPoint at a trade show booth. There's a lot of stuff that you've described here. What kind of a
Yep.
marketing team? And do you see companies maybe err on the side of getting specialists? I hired a graphic designer, I hired a videographer too soon. When do they need to, think generally and what kind of person
Yep.
they need? And when do they need to move into specialists or contractors or agencies in order to help them kind of get there?
Yeah. I mean, I think again, broken record, like it will depend a little bit on, or the golden caveat is that it does depend a little bit on like what your product is and the motion. And maybe you have an incredibly complex product, so product marketing is going to be critical early on. It could make sense to hire that as kind of somebody who's more specialized. In general, I absolutely lean towards hiring generalists and supplementing with specialists. And that could be through contractors, through agencies, through freelancers, having that flexibility to pull specialists in when your campaign strategy and your kind of go to market strategy mandates that that's kind of the next step you should take. Otherwise, if you lean too hard, as we even talked about in terms of where are all the touch points and how are you getting the maximum amount of coverage, if you lean too hard in maybe an SEO specialist or a paid media specialist early on, you're likely going to have gaps elsewhere. And so a really strong generalist is going to be, and I've worked with them my entire career, so they do exist. They're absolutely out there. There's some brilliant marketing generalists that are great in early stage. And so getting those folks to kind of engage because they're also the type of people who have the intellectual curiosity to say, well, I've never done this type of digital campaign before, but I'm going to figure it out. Right. And so I know that this is what we've aligned on from a strategy perspective. And I have the perseverance and will and desire to go learn new skills. And that's where generalists can just be incredibly helpful. And then as you grow and you start to see more demand in certain areas, that's when you hire a specialist, right? And continue to evolve from that perspective.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Abby. Getting those generalists who are smart and can really manage all of that and are knowledgeable is challenging, but that sounds really like the way to go. Well, this has been a great conversation. I think you've given a lot of good advice to those startups trying to figure it out and get a marketing strategy that
Yeah.
aligns with what the business is all about. If someone wants to reach out to you to learn more about what you do or just connect with you on this topic, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Yes, I mean, I would say emailing me, Abby at Inkwell GTM is going to be your .com is going to be kind of the fastest path directly to my inbox. Also on LinkedIn, and happy to connect and provide resources and network effect too is really helpful for early stage founders. So happy to be helpful however I can.
Great. Well, Abby, thanks again. Thanks again for
Thanks
taking
so
the
much
time.
for having me.